morning, everyone, and I want to thank you all for joining us today for this really important webinar with Jessie Wente, as well as our panelists following. Just a quick housekeeping note before we get started. Use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom feature, and we'll get to your questions after Jessie, as well as after the panel. And then in addition, for this webinar specifically, in the top right-hand corner of your Zoom platform, if you get out of the full screen mode, it might be best to switch to presenter mode just because the panelists are signed in and we want you to be able to focus on who's presenting at the moment. With that, I will hand it off to John and get ready for Jessie.
Thank you, Peyton, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. This is actually our first special event of 3 that will lead up to our big Public Trust Summit, which we'll be hosting on October 13th and 14th later next fall. So first off, I'd like to take a moment just to thank Syngenta as a presenting sponsor for our webinar today. Syngenta and CCFI have a long-standing relationship, and the sponsorship from Syngenta has made this webinar possible. Syngenta have staff from 123 nationalities and are active in over 90 countries. And as we'll hear later from Lynn Smith, embrace and encourage diversity and see it as a key to their success. But before I introduce our keynote speaker, I'd just like to take a moment to describe why CCFI has chosen to encourage dialogue in this issue and to host this event. And to do this, I'll have to go back to last summer or last fall, when a diverse group of people from across Canada's food system loosely formed and got together to discuss ways to further advance EDI in our sector. As we continued with our discussions, it became apparent that someone or some organization needed to play a role in coordinating the activities of the group. And since CCFI is a national nonprofit with a structure and we have a mandate to collaborate and advance shared values, which EDI is, we offered to help out with this role. And more recently, we formed a smaller steering committee from the larger group. And this committee is actually working on identifying activities that we can take to support this important issue. And the goal of the smaller committee and the larger group is to work collaboratively with the many individuals, organizations, and companies in the food system who have a commitment to EDI and are actively advancing it within the food system. We also hope to facilitate dialogue among industry stakeholders and share success stories. We're also seeking funding opportunities so that we can potentially offer, training or resources to the sector. And we see this webinar as a bit of a coming out party of sorts and providing an opportunity to discuss EDI and learn from our keynote speaker and from our panelists who will present later on some ideas and activities in the issue. So now I'd actually like to take a moment to introduce our keynote speaker this morning. Jessie Wente is an Anishinaabe writer, broadcaster, speaker, and arts leader. He was born and raised in Toronto. He's a member of the Serpent River First Nation. Jesse is best known for 24 years as a columnist for CBC Radio's Metro Morning. He also spent 11 years with the Toronto Film Festival, the last 7 as the director of film programs at the Tiff Bell Lightbox. He's an outspoken advocate for Indigenous rights and First Nations, Métis, and Inuit art. He has spoken at the International Forum of Indigenous Peoples, the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, the Canadian Arts Summit, the Cultural Summit of the Americas, and numerous universities and colleges. Jesse has served on the board of directors of the Toronto Arts Festival, the Imaginative Film and Media Festival, and Native Earth Performing Arts. And he was recently appointed as the chair of the Canada Council on the Arts, the first Indigenous Canadian to hold this important position. So Jesse, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, hi everyone. Thank you so much, John, for that expansive introduction. Always a bit embarrassing. And hello to everyone out there. I'm so thankful and honored to be here with you today, even virtually, as we all are getting used to in this time. And it's a real honor for me to be able to speak with you. So thank you very much. And as you might know, just by looking at me, I'm a big fan of food. So I want to thank all of you and in the US are rapidly diversifying in terms of their nationalities and their of origin. And so, you know, in Toronto, where I'm speaking to you from today, for example, we're already a city that is majority non-white as a race. And we know that America will achieve that overall by 2045, and Canada will follow similarly. So we're sort of on a trend just naturally where your audience, your consumers, your clients are going to become more diverse just over time. The staff that you hire are going to become more diverse. And all of that just means that it's good to start engaging in this work now, because it is inevitability that we're all going to face. So I will explain what organic diversity is. And usually when I give these talks, I actually go through a long discussion of EDI as a concept and what it means and the language we use and some of the strategies. And we will do all of those things. And I usually end on an anecdote, a teaching from an Anishinaabe teaching about the forest. And back when I used to do these things live, I would have a PowerPoint. I'd show you lots of pictures of forests that I've taken over the years, all over Canada and all over the world. But I won't do that today, because that means you would just look at forest, which granted might be better than looking at me for 45 minutes, but let's give it a shot. But if I could ask all of you, because I'm going to hope that you've all been to a forest. And if you haven't been to a forest, please try to find one. In Canada, it's not that hard because they are incredible places. But hopefully everyone has some experience of the forest. Even forests in winter are amazing places. And I would just ask you now to just think of the forest for a moment, picture it in your head. Really think about being inside a forest, or what it is when you look into a forest. Because they're wonderful places. And for my people, the Anishinaabe, they are often sacred places that provide so much, that give us so much. And along with things like the lakes, what we would call the big water, they're really central to how we have lived on this land for the last, 12 or 13,000 years, give or take. And they're very much central to our worldview as well. So if you think of the forests you visited, if you think of those, was there only one kind of tree in the forest? Was there only one kind of insect, if it was summertime and they were buzzing around, or one type of animal or plant or bird or anything? And there really isn't. Successful forests typically have many different kinds of trees and plants and animals and insects. And that's because, and this is the teaching, that's because diversity is the natural order of the world. Mother Nature designs the world to be diverse, just naturally. And some scientists, they call this biodiversity, but you don't even need the bio part. It's just diversity. And typically, the most successful forests are the most diverse. Even in places like deserts, Antarctica, the poles, they're diverse environments. They're not stagnant. They're not host to only one thing. And so once we acknowledge that, diversity is sort of the natural state of the world, of how it operates, then we can begin to understand that when we see a forest, because some will think of a forest, and there's some forests that actually only have one kind of tree, and they're often in rows. Or think of a forest of Christmas trees where they've been planted. And the key is that humans did that we planted the trees that way. And the lesson we're supposed to take from that is that when you find yourself in a space that isn't diverse, that doesn't naturally have diversity in it, humans did that. And that includes the structures we build ourselves, the systems we build ourselves, the human systems, whether that's governments or companies or communities or organizations or whatever it may be. If you find those spaces, boardrooms, if you find that those aren't diverse spaces, we have to acknowledge and understand that that's human decision making. That is an outcome of human decision making, and there's power in that, because if it's human decision making, it means we can make other decisions that more align with the natural order, that foster the natural diversity, the organic diversity that we often see in forests and natural systems. And that is a good thing, because it means we can make different decisions where humans have made other decisions. And so if you're in an industry or a company or a sector or whatever, and you're now engaging in this sort of work, that's typically a response or recognition that you have found yourself in a non-diverse place. And that the important piece is to acknowledge that humans made decisions at some point in the past that have contributed to arriving at this place and the need to do this work. So you can start making new decisions now. And so keep that in mind as we talk through these things. If you can, keep yourself in the forest for as much as this talk. I would love to do this talk in a forest one day. Maybe that's the summer version of this talk, as we all go to a forest, because they do provide an enormous amount of teaching. And I'm going to return to the teaching of the forest later on. But I also wanted to start, and why I label it organic diversity, is that I want to differentiate it from EDI, or equity, diversity, and inclusion work, which is very common terminology that we hear today. And it's terminology that I think, despite the fact that I work so much in this field, and despite the fact that I believe in those ideas of diversity and inclusion, that when these words or ideas are applied to organizations or other spaces seeking a wider variety of people or ideas to be engaged in those spaces, that these words actually fail a little bit. They become somewhat problematic. Why? Well, when used in this way, so when an organization or a sector or an industry decides that they need to be more diverse or more inclusive, they are actively making a decision to do that way. So when you're making a decision, that means that you can decide the opposite way, right? So you can also decide not to be diverse, but you're now deciding to be diverse. And as we said, if you're not diverse now, it's likely because there was a decision, maybe not to be exclusive. Maybe that wasn't a decision, but certainly unintended consequences have arrived at a non-inclusive or a non-diverse space. And that key, that idea that it can be a decision, is suggestive and illustrative of a power dynamic that exists that makes this work difficult, because it means that somewhere along the line, someone is deciding to be diverse, and the power lies with them and not with necessarily the people that you actually want to include in your organization. And as long as that power dynamic exists, it can get in the way of the organic diversity that I'm actually talking about. The type where you don't need to have an EDI program because it's naturally occurring in your organization. So some of the words we use, some of the framework we use can be a bit difficult, right? Because no one forced the forest. The forest naturally grew diverse. The forest didn't decide what trees or what plants there. They're actually in relationship to each other. And we'll return to that idea in a moment. So this can be a struggle for organizations because they are not natural entities. They are human creations. And this is true of industries and so much of what we've built to support ourselves on this planet is that they're not necessarily natural, which is unusual among animal species, right? Most other animals don't really create unnatural things to support their existence. That's really only true of humans. So we struggle because they are formed by humans. They're formed over time. So ethics and morals change over time. And one of the reasons why there's so much calls for equity and diversity now in our society, in our organizations, in our structures, is because historically, these spaces weren't built with that in mind. They actually tended to be built sort of exclusively, to be honest. And that is a reflection of how these nations were built, which was not to be they weren't built to be inclusive. And you can go back and look at the founding documents and look at all sorts of things of evidence of how they weren't built to be that way. And how often our organizations, our structures reflect those political beings. So now we do have to decide to actually engage in it. But what I'm going to suggest to you over this talk is that how we approach that should be driven by the desire to have it grow organically and not always be in a role where the powerful decide to engage with those without power, that we actually have to foster equality through a sharing of power. So one of the reasons organizations struggle and to return to the forest is because they're not living in relationship to one another. So again, imagine ourselves back in the forest and we can see the different trees. And even when there are different species of trees, you may have a pine tree, a maple tree, a birch tree, they all grow separately up towards the sky. But if we were to look underground, we would find their roots are like this, entangled. They're intermeshed. And that's because they rely on each other. They're interdependent. And this is true of the animals and the insects. And many of you already know this, especially, you're in the food business, you grow food. You know that we need the bees to pollinate the flowers, and they live in relationship with one another. The trees provide shelter for the animals provide fertilizer for the flower. This is how it works. And we sometimes interrupt this, and we end up having to provide that natural relationship ourselves, because we've interrupted the actual natural course of things. But there's always a need for that interdependence. And so often with our organizations, what has happened, why they aren't diverse, why they aren't inclusive, is that they're not in right relations with the communities they now wish to serve or that they wish to include into themselves, whether that be their workforce or their client base or the communities they serve. They're not in relationship with them. And so again, if you think of the bee, what is the key to its relationship with the flower, right? Because the flower also provides pollen for the bee. One big key central to that relationship is consistency. That the flower comes every year, the bee comes every year, they live interdependently, right? Their needs are met by each other. But so often what we have when we're trying to bring other communities into an organization or an industry or a sector that may not be diverse or that community may not already be present, is we reach out when we want something from them, their money, their business, their work, their effort, whatever it may be, but we're not necessarily there all the time. There's a lack of consistency in the relationship between these communities. And if you think of even just your personal relationships with your family, with your friends, consistency is a big part of it, right? That you're there for each other in the good times, the bad times, the in-between times, all the time. That often is how you measure the strength of those relationships. When you go through sickness or trouble, COVID, how do you measure the value of your relationships? Who's there for you in all of those times, in good and bad, right? And that's true of organizations and industries when they want to include other communities. Are you there for each other all the time? Is there consistency? So one of the things you should be thinking about is how do you consistently have that relationship? Or if you don't currently have a relationship, start building that relationship now and be consistent. Be there even when you don't need anything from them. Be there when they need something from you. And you will grow. That will be the beginnings. That's the lanes of the seeds of that organic diversity that I think is what we actually all want, right? We don't want to have EDI departments. We want this to just naturally be true. So you have to start building the live and right relations with the communities that you actually want to include. And I'll give you an example from my personal life. When I was a younger person, this is now more than 20 years ago, I used to sit on something called the Police Chiefs Youth Advisory Council in Toronto, back when I would have been called, back when I qualified as a youth, whatever that is. And this was a group of young people that would sit with the chief of police in Toronto and talk over issues. And one of the big issues at the time was actually inclusion and diversity, and how the police could better serve all the communities. And so for the police chief at the time, he was really interested in how to make the police force more diverse, how to get more police officers, more employees that were representative of the communities that they were serving. And he asked this youth council how we might envision doing that. And the chief approached this issue. He talked about how good a job it was, that it offered benefits, that it offered a pension, stable employment, these sorts of things that might be attractive to our community members to join the police force. And, not uninteresting ideas, right? These are things are universal in terms of what people want out of a job. But it was while I was on this youth committee that I personally started to have increased interactions with the police in Toronto. And I don't mean as part of the role on this youth council. At the time, I had grown my hair long. It was down all the way down my back. I would often wear it in a ponytail or in a long braid. I lived in Kensington Market in Toronto. And this is the Kensington Market of the early 90s. So not the Kensington Market of today, if you're familiar with this rather historic marketplace in Toronto, which is in our, what we would call Chinatown. And it's largely gentrified now, but this was before any of that had happened, when it was really home to students and artists more than anything else. And often at night I was an insomniac, and I would go downtown, walk to the video game arcades, which really dates me because I don't even think arcades are a thing anymore. And often, a couple dozen times, let's say, if that counts as often, I would be stopped by the police for doing nothing. I was walking down the street with my long hair, and they would ask what I was doing, where I was going, who I was going to see. We call this now carding, is what we would call this now. But back then, I didn't know what to call it, and frankly, I was embarrassed. I never brought it up to the police chief because I didn't want him to know. I didn't want my parents to know. I didn't want my workplace to know. Interactions with the police were not really seen as something to be good. But the point is that here you have the police chief asking how he can have a better relationship with the Indigenous community, while that organization is stopping an Indigenous person for walking down the street and not breaking any law whatsoever. And you can offer all the benefits in the world to that community, but if their relationship with you is not one of employment, but is one of, you're going to stop me on the street for walking, then I'm going to suggest you are forever going to be challenged to have that community present in your organization in the way you may want. And that's because the relationship we're having with you isn't one of employment, it's the one of on the street. And so when you start to think about how you live in right relations with the communities you may want to include, that you may want to see present, either as your clients, as your customers, or as your workforce, as your leaders, even, you really have to examine the relationship you currently have with them, if you even have one. And by examine, I mean, don't examine it from the viewpoint of the chief, which was the relationship he wanted to have. You actually really have to look at what is the relationship you truly have. And is that the greatest barrier to inclusion in your organization? Because I would suggest the police today in Toronto still struggle with their relationship with the Indigenous population in Toronto. And that's because of the relationship they have with us, which isn't one of our presence in their workforce as a safe space. It's of us being over-policed in the streets. And so that presents a real barrier that they are going to have to overcome. And I would suggest that they won't overcome it until they alter the way they police the First Nations community here in Toronto and make their organization a safe space for us. So if you want to be more diverse and inclusive, you have to figure out that relationship. And if it's not a right relationship, as we would call it, if it's the wrong relationship, that's where you start. There's no use. Anyone you hire, anyone you bring in, it won't work, because that's what they're going to have to fix right away. And you can start that work yourself now before you ever hire anyone. Before you look at the hiring practices and those sorts of very tangible efforts to be more inclusive and diverse, you should really examine that relationship, because you'll set that person up to fail if you hire them. And then the other key reason I like to think of these things in terms of relationships is because it allows us to think of each community uniquely, because they are unique. And the relationships you form and how they are to be included in your space are also unique, with specific approaches, needs, and outcomes. So this is also where the limits of the terms diversity and inclusion and equity come in, because those approaches are not universal. Each community are actually going to need their own unique approach. They may even need their own unique outcome in terms of what they see, because communities are not marginalized for exactly the same reasons and exactly in the same ways, if you look at history, right? So that means the solutions to that marginalization, for the society to be more inclusive of those forcibly marginalized groups, will have to address those unique ways in which they were marginalized and are marginalized. So, for example, to think again of the forest, does each tree or plant need the exact same amount of sunlight or water for it to be successful? No. Same with each community. They don't need exactly the same things. And I'll again use my own personal example to illustrate this. So my community, and by that I don't mean Serpent River, I mean more in the most broad idea, the Indigenous community. When we think of us, I'm not sure inclusion is actually what we're seeking, because First Nations, Inuit, Métis groups are actually not traditional equity seeking groups. We are sovereignty seeking groups, which means we existed as sovereign people before Canada ever existed as a thing. And that is still where we're seeking to be, because most of the treaties, and I don't want to go into a whole history here, but most of the treaties that were signed actually did not cede our sovereignty over to the state of Canada. The treaty actually, my people specifically signed, it wasn't even with Canada. It was with the Crown in England. And so we never agreed to be part of Canada. So including us in Canada may not actually be the exact outcome we're looking for. We're seeking sovereignty. And so even when this comes to organizations, so for example, I'm the chair of the Canada Council for the Arts. One of the ways they've addressed the fact that Indigenous peoples are seeking sovereignty as opposed to equity is that they developed an entirely specific Indigenous arts program that is administered by Indigenous people with its own budget. That is a measure of sovereignty or self-determination. So that aligns more with what these groups are seeking, as opposed to other marginalized groups. So that will require treating all these relationships uniquely, and the positionality and the approach that they're coming. And I think when we just lump them as equity-seeking groups or diversity and inclusion, we actually wash away what makes them specific and how this has happened and how we actually have to approach them. And I would urge you to embrace the uniqueness of these communities, and that the outcomes may not be the same for everyone. The strategies may not be the same for everyone. And that is actually all okay. And that will make your work more effective if you embrace that now, as opposed to lumping everyone together. And this is true, for example, even if you think of other communities, like say the LGBTQ2S community, if you break all of those letters apart, they're actually all specific and require their own strategies around inclusion and diversity. And they also point out that people can belong to more than one marginalized group. And this is what we call intersectionality. So if I'm LGBTQ2S, but also racialized, well, then I start to have intersections. And we need to acknowledge intersections, because as they grow, you can literally think of them as intersections, like a traffic, a four-way traffic intersection. If you think of your destination of where you want to be, and you're here, you know that it will take you longer to get to your destination the more intersections you have to encounter, because that provides an opportunity for a stoplight, right? For a stop sign to make you pause. So the person who has less intersections has a straight line. They don't have a stop sign or any chance to be derailed. They have a clearer path, right? And that means they'll arrive there quicker. The more intersections you have means you're likely to arrive there slower. And there's a higher probability you'll be stopped before you ever get to the destination. And so when you hear the term intersectionality, that's what it's actually referring to. And we need to acknowledge that that's true too. And so that will require its own specific work. And so consider that nature of those relationships as we go forward. And once you begin to understand the type of relationship that you need to build with various groups, you can go about building it. But that's the real tricky part, right? Lots of organizations, lots of institutions, governments, sectors, industries, they want to become more inclusive and agree with the fundamental principle of inclusivity and diversity, but struggle when it comes to actually the rubber hitting the road and taking actions about it is where we often see some stumbles. So now what I'd like to do is talk through some of the best practices in terms of how to become more inclusive, as well as some of the barriers that are quite common when organizations, institutions, industries seek to do this work. And so one of the things I advise organizations is that it has to be a holistic approach, okay? And what I mean by that is that when it comes to EDI work, organic diversity or inclusion work that we're really seeking, it has to be engaged on all levels of the organization, sector, government, whatever it may be. And that in fact, usually diversity initiatives begin where you begin to actually see the most diversities on the lower level. So if we think of a organizational hierarchy or a structure, that's where the touch points are. So where you're interacting with the public, that's where you'll likely see the issues pop up, but also where you're likely to become more diverse faster. The key, though, and this is key, is that without the buy-in from the very top, that's all it will ever do, is at that lowest front-facing level. So you need, whether it's your board of directors, whether if you're a government, whether it's your prime minister or your president or whatever, whether it's your sectoral leader, whatever it may be, they need to be invested in this work, and it needs to have metrics that they can be tracked on in terms of what success looks like for it to actually seep down throughout the organization. And wherever you go to various levels of organizational hierarchy or a sector or whatever, wherever there stops being metrics or accountability of ways that to measure that this is actually happening, that's where it will cease to happen. Instantly, you'll see it. And so that's why it's important that your board be diverse. And if it's not diverse now, that becomes a strategy, and that they're invested, and that they have a way to measure the success of your leaders, your CEOs, whatever it may be, that they're also doing it. And so that's why data collection is going to be central to your efforts. If you don't know where you're beginning, and listen, so many organizations, they don't want to actually collect the data because they know it's going to be terrible. and they don't want to admit it to themselves. As someone who comes from a racialized, marginalized group, we know that it's bad already. That won't be surprising to us. So you have to do it in order to understand what the floor is, so you can set benchmarks to actually reach. And data collection is complex for all sorts of reasons around privacy and laws and all sorts of things. But you need to start exploring how you collect the data to know where you're building from. And then you need to build those metrics into the performance evaluation of the people that you work with, right to the very top of that. And that includes when it comes to governments. If we want this to be a goal for them, we have to judge them on how they do as well. What is the makeup of their government, and so on and so forth. So it has to be right at the top. Secondly, resources. Becoming more diverse and inclusive when you have historically not been. And if you are engaged in this work now, that is an acknowledgement that you have historically not been this way, is not cheap. Okay? Just like forming these organizations in the first place wasn't cheap, allowing them to be organically diverse is not going to be inexpensive. It's going to take dedicated resources to this, resources that need to be in core budgets. These cannot be nice to have things that you do now, but they get abandoned. This has to be central to your purpose. And again, as I mentioned off the top, it will be good business. These are investments that will pay off in the long run. Absolutely 100% guaranteed they will pay off. So it's okay to see that these are resources you have to spend, because if they're not valuable enough to be in your core budget, they're not going to be valuable enough to do this work, because there's so many bumps and barriers. So it's, diversity and inclusion is not a seasonal activity. It's something you have to build. Again, the best and most diverse forests are not ones that were planted in 5 years. They're old growth. They've been planted and nurtured for a long time. Yes, you can have a forest in 1 or 2 years or 4, but the most diverse and rich have had that investment in them from Mother Nature for many, many years. And we have to acknowledge that when systems are not diverse, that we've been investing into that for many years. So if the goal is to be more diverse, we can't shirk on the investment now. And yet that is often what we see. So don't do that. And the other big thing is that hiring is central. It's impossible to diversify your client base if you're not going to diversify your workforce. That is just simple fact. And it is part of the natural relationship. The community sees themselves present in your workforce. They'll begin to see themselves as part of your customer base. But when you're hiring, don't hire one person especially into an EDI specific role, and think that will achieve anything. It won't. Typically, that person will need more supports than average to do that work, and do not expect that person to bring their community with them. I've often been the only First Nations person in many rooms. And frankly, there have been times where I have been the only First Nations person to ever be in that room. It is a very lonely and daunting task. And I don't want to be in those rooms. The only comfort I take of being alone in those spaces is the one I take that I can eventually be joined by others, right? And that takes resources and dedication. And too often, retention of those employees is actually the problem in this era, not hiring them. We've seen a huge spate in academia. For example, after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of 2015, there was a bunch of hires to indigenize universities. A bunch of those people have left those jobs. And because they weren't supported, did not get the resources needed. And when that happens, okay, when you make the hire, they're not supported and they leave, your relationship with that community, even though they didn't bring the whole community, that's going to be a point of fracture. So I'll give you an example. There was an organization I worked with. I was the only Indigenous person to have ever held that job in that organization. When I left, because I ultimately didn't feel supported, that job has not been filled by another Indigenous person. I don't know if that job ever will be, ever again. And as a result, that organization still struggles with its relationship with the First Nations community because they just have they didn't build it initially. They started to build one, and then they weren't able to support the people internally. And now externally, the community can see that, and that becomes a problem. So dedicate resources to those folks, and keep that relationship consistent. It may mean you have to learn a different language or any sorts of things. And I don't mean literally a different language, but different vocabulary. And you have to do that. That's the part of the investment of doing this. And acknowledging that when you bring that person in, they don't speak for anyone. I'm Anishinaabe. I do not speak for all Anishinaabe. I speak for me, really. And then this is the biggest pitfall of all, which is agency or the sharing of power. All the equity, diversity, and inclusion work in the world can happen. If you're not prepared to share power, they will fail. Because power or agency, the ability to influence change, to make decisions, that's where the rubber really meets the road. Everything else is just representational politics. It won't work. Again, I've been in spaces where I'm the only First Nations person to have ever been there, I only stay in those spaces when I feel that I have power. I'm being shared the power. As soon as I feel that I don't have that, I leave, because it's not worth it. I become tokenized. I just become a symbol to suggest diversity, but not actually be diverse in practice. And being tokenized is no fun. Take it from me. So don't do that to other folks. Share the power. And this is one of the things people often view sharing of power as a diminishing of their own. It isn't. In practice, what happens is if you share power, you will actually gain more. Your agency will grow. This is the funny thing with so much of equity, diversity work, equality issues in our society, is that if we actually resolve them, it would benefit everyone. If our communities were more equal, that would actually benefit everyone, not just those folks suffering that are unequal now. And so sharing that power will make you more powerful, will strengthen your company, will make your sector better, be more ready and sustainable for future moments, right? Think of down the road when we go through another crisis like this, because let's face it, we probably will, or maybe not us, our children might, if they're already diverse, if the communities that they want to serve are already present, and we already are like this underneath the ground, right? Underneath the surface, we're living interdependently, we'll be so much better equipped to survive up and downs in the marketplace, up and downs in the literal environment of the world, if we're all like this. That's how forests survive, because underneath the ground, they're like this. When they're all alone, trees can fall over more easily. When their roots are intertwined, they're stronger. This is really the root for success, is that, when we grant agency and power, you can really make it, your company ultimately will be more successful. Diversity is a pathway to success. It's a pathway to sustainability, and it will help everyone. So that's what we should do. And if I can bring us back to the forest, imagine yourselves as people who can build for us, right? And who plant the trees that will provide shade for future generations that we'll never even meet, because we don't plant the tree thinking that we'll enjoy it. It's really about planting it for someone in the future. And we can absolutely do this. The reason we find ourselves in these situations is because of decisions made in the past, which just means we can make new ones now. It's in your hands to do that. Don't be afraid. It will benefit all of us in the long run, and our industries, our businesses, our societies, our cultures will be much better off. The planet will be much better off when we do this, because we will have to do this no matter what. And so let's start now. Let's all be the forest that we want to be. I want to thank you so much for listening to this talk. And I think we have time now for some questions and hopefully I can provide some answers. So miigwech, 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 chi miigwech for listening.
Amazing. Thank you, Jesse. That was fantastic. Gave us some great takeaways and things to really consider. I'll start us off, and then there's a couple questions getting started. So you gave us some great takeaways and action items, but do you have anything specific for the food system that comes to mind?
I think for the food system, I think it's about probably both the people, but also practices and philosophies. So much of what we think about diversity is people, but people bring ideas. And I think when I think of the food system, what sort of an important system for all of us as we need it. We want it to be more sustainable. And I think that's sustainable sort of both as a business, but also as like a planet environmental sort of thing. And I think diversity is actually how you get there, is how you gain sustainability. So I would think of that in modes of practice, but also in terms of people. And I think, I guess that would probably be where I would land. I try to present the principles that are adaptable to sort of any industry, even ones that I'm not fully familiar with how they sort of work. But I would think with systems that are so important that like humans depend on, those are places where these issues really have to be confronted sort of most urgently, right? Because that's where sustainability for just us as a species can come into question. So that's why environmental issues are so important to all of us, because they affect all of us. And I would lump the food system as one of those key systems. Like we need air, we need water, we need food. Shelter would be the other key one. These are universal things that we as a species all share. And so in some ways that should allow us, free us up to be as diverse as we want to be, because we all share the concern, right? It's not like it's something that's exclusive to one corner of the planet or one segment of society. These are universal. We all need food and we all want it to be sustainable. And I want to make sure my kids and their kids and the generations I'll never meet can also eat. And so that's what we would center on. So I hope that answered the question on some way.
Lauren Martin said, excellent presentation. And you're speaking to us about increasing organizational diversity, but she's curious about how increasing organizational diversity can translate to increasing community diversity. So for example, many of the organizations on this call are supporting a very homogenous community, which needs to diversify in order to survive. So for example, if we give voice to white male farmers, how do we make place for all of the others for the next generation?
Right. Well, I mean, so there's a lot of history in that question to unpack, because, it's important to acknowledge why that community is the way that is, how we ended up there, because that will help you figure out how you unpack that thing, right? And so always understanding how we get to this destination is key to unpacking. But I would suggest that white male farmers, again, as I spoke to at the beginning, the reality is they're the one side. I'm going to guess that they don't only want to sell to one specific set of communities. And even if they sell to one, say, corporate entity that is then using their product to make other products, that corporate entity undoubtedly doesn't want to only sell to one segment of the population. And so you need to understand why that's important. So this is the difference between like who's the supply versus who's the demand. And this is the reality is this is not unique to your sector, because most and this is sadly, this is the history of this place, right? Is that most industries were funneled to a specific community, were built up by a specific community to serve a specific community, often to the exclusion of others. I'll use my industry, the arts sector, very specifically. The Canada Council for the Arts, when it was formed in 1957, did not consider Indigenous art to exist. They thought it was craft or primitive. And so we weren't eligible for any arts funding, which means the result of that is that arts and culture in Canada was the purview of a very specific and exclusive community, right? So ballet or opera or whatever you want to take gets privileged over the round dance or beading, right? And as a result, those become industries. Beading is still like a craft that we do. The dream catcher, which is a sacred item from the Anishinaabe culture, are now mostly made in China, right? We were locked out of that industry. We imagine how First Nations people could have financially gained if the production of dream catchers had been entirely left to us and not exported out. So the point is that in all sectors and industries, you're thinking about that same dynamic has occurred. But those business owners are now faced with the fact that so those farmers, business owners, whatever you want to talk about it, they're now faced with the fact that their consumer base is rapidly diversifying in a way that their corporate structure is not. And this is the crux of the moment we've arrived in, right? Where the consumer is way ahead of the industries in terms of what they want to see and what they want to consume and who they should be consuming from. And industries are now doing EDI work to catch up. So the first thing I would do is the best, easiest way to make space is sounds simple, but make space. I often get asked, well, how do I hire? What do you mean, how do you hire? Hire someone. It may mean you change your metrics. It may mean you change what qualifies. It may mean who you invite in. So in other words, this is something I talk about at the Arts Council, like they have an idea of what a core funding organization is. Well, those metrics were all decided when Indigenous arts weren't even a thing. So now you may have to change your metrics if you actually want to include. So if you want to include small farmers, small producers, invite them in, start that dialogue. You'll get resistance, of course, from people who feel threatened. But the thing with folks who feel threatened by inclusion is they often feel that their including others will mean that their part of it will be diminished. Functionally, that has never been true, right? Like what the only invasive species that you can sort of insert is the most invasive species that disrupts diversity is humans. Humans do that more than a fish or a moth, and we hear all about these invasive species from other parts of the world that are ruinous. We're the most invasive part of it. And so, yeah, we just have, some of it is just doing it and being resistant and knowing that your industry is in the midst, I would suspect, of an evolutionary change, as almost all industries are at this moment. And when you're in those moments of evolutionary change, that is actually an opportunity for this exact work, is for you to embrace and bring in communities, providers, sectors that were the business model, because I think what we're seeing is all of those models are up for grabs now in the new age. And so be future looking, invite them in now, because my guess is 10 years down the road, you'll have wished you invited them in earlier. So you might as well do it now. And one of the most greatest benefits of this work is when you sit in a room in a truly diverse space, the ideas that come forward can move you to places that you never imagined. This is the key to this work, is that we are so much better as together than we are separate, and that human beings are a social species. We actually are really bad at soul survival. We're way better when we're like this, and yet we set up systems to keep us apart all the time. Don't do that. Just start inviting them in. It seems simple. It won't be simple because you'll get all sorts of barriers about why you can't do it. Ignore them. The Indigenous Screen Office, which I now run, was advocated for 20 years. All it took for it to come into being was one person to say, oh yeah, we'll do that. That's all it took. That's all it will take. One person to say, no, let's do this separately. Let's invite this community who has not been in this space before. Let's invite them in and listen to them. And suddenly you'll grow, everyone will benefit. It's amazing what happens. It's amazing what happens.
The next question, Tony and Stuart kind of had a similar question. So what strategy do you find most effective for dealing with defensive people who maybe not be as open-minded or resentful in diversity discussions with non-minority groups? There seems to be some defensiveness or fear of losing something or being insulted when talking about diversity and non-minority people. And they both want to understand, how can you effectively avoid or address this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you can avoid it, because I think we need to speak plainly, and we need to, we're in 2021 and we're still talking about the same sort of equity movements that they were talking about when the civil rights movement began in the 60s. And it's important. I always like to remind people that we are still in the civil rights movement. It never ended. Black Lives Matter, Idle No More, Me Too, all of these things are just extensions of what started, our ancestors started years ago, years and years and years ago. We're still in it. So I don't know if you can totally prevent it from happening or avoid it. I do think it's a trick, though, because I do think that whenever you're doing equity work, those that have been very privileged for so long will feel any sort of touch. And oddly, it's actually not a loss of privilege for them. Sometimes they'll feel any gaining of privilege for others inherently means a loss. And there's a great book that was just published called The Sum of Us, which is about this exact thing. Because, and this will be uncomfortable for some to acknowledge, but I'm going to say it because it's true. The reason that happens is because when these countries were formed, that actually was the dynamic by which they were formed. Some segments, communities, had to lose in order for other communities to gain. And if we want to be very specific, Indigenous peoples and Black people had to lose under capitalism in these states in order for others to gain. And this dynamic has created this idea that that is what actually has to happen, that someone has to lose in order for others to gain. But that is, how should I put this? Wrong in every possible way. It's actually not a true thing. It's a belief because of history and because of the nature of these places. But if you actually ask me, Indigenous folks, Black folks, we don't see our gaining of things as something that means you have to lose, that others have to. It's because it's actually not true. And if you look at the history of the civil rights movement, when marginalized communities have gained, when women have gained, men benefit from those gains as well. Right? All communities benefit. This book that I'm talking about, The Sum of Us, you should go read it. But she uses a great example, and I wish, I'm blanking on the author's name, but she uses a great example of a public pool in Georgia that existed when it was segregated. It was built when Blacks could not attend the pool. Only whites could attend the pool. When it became law that they had to let Blacks into the pool, they cemented the pool. Because and the pool has never been rebuilt. That community denied itself a pool just because they didn't want to allow others in. When in fact, if they had just, Heather McGee is the author, thank you for whoever put that, Heather McGee, The Sum of Us. You can get an audio book and all that stuff. Excellent read. She talks about how they cemented so the community has now forever denied itself access to a pool because they wouldn't include this other community. If they had included them, guess what would have happened? Entire generations of children would have swam in that pool and had a fun summer in Georgia, which is hot as anything. So when people do that, it's a reflective thing because that's sort of what has been ingrained in these societies, is that that's what's happened because that's how they built themselves. But that isn't actually what has to happen. And in fact, when you allow others in, you'll see, I guarantee this will happen. your organization, your industry will grow and get better. That is literally the only outcome that happens. And if you to refer to this book again, she references a study where they saw states in the South have less public libraries, less public schools, less public everything, because they didn't want to build those for Black people. So they denied themselves these things just so they could deny another community. It makes zero sense. And it will make zero sense to those people if they do that now, because again, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years down the road, when they are reliant on those communities to be part of their business, where will they be if they haven't done this work now? Those are the companies, and this is really harsh, strong tea I'm about to say, but those companies that don't do this work now are the companies that will be closed in 10, 15, 20 years. And that is just, I don't know how else to put it, but like demographic reality, and especially because of environmental issues. We know that human migrations that is only going to increase, that we know populations are going to shift as the environment degrades over time. So yeah, I think there is just a blunt reality of what is happening in the world, that if you deny now, you are going to hurt your business. You are hurting your business. Maybe not in the moment, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road, when you want to pass it on to whoever's next, you're going to be passing on damaged goods. So it's better to do that work now. And personally, when I'm confronted with it, I shrug these days. I mean, I'm used to the idea that, you know, something someone used to say to me, I used to hear all the time, was get over it. Because I used to talk about my family and stuff, you know, because my family went to residential school and all this sort of stuff. And I've realized that when someone says get over it to me, they're actually talking to themselves, that they're the ones that need to get over what they've been told. I don't need to get over anything. I'm feet firmly planted in the here and now. Those that struggle with it, it's because they want a past that can't exist anymore. And that is certainly true post-COVID.
Amazing. Jesse, this has been fantastic. We do have a couple other questions, but we need to get to our panel. So what I'll suggest, if we can get those questions written out, I will send them to everybody in a follow-up email. With that, a huge thank you. It's been great having you. On behalf of the Canadian food system, this has been enlightening and amazing, and just thank you again.
Well, Chimigwich again for listening, and I look forward to enjoying all of your work on my dinner table soon enough. So thank you all so very much.
Amazing, thank you. John, with that, I'll hand it off to you to introduce our panelists and get started.
Thank you, Peyton. And thanks again, Jesse. Wonderful job. So I'll ask my panelists to sign in, please, to unmute themselves and turn on their cameras. Wonderful, super. So I'm going to moderate the second section of this, where we have four industry leaders from across Canada to talk about their role in EDI and what their thoughts are. And I have fairly robust introductions to each of you. And I actually want to read them all because I think it speaks to the caliber of the people that we have here today. And once again, I want to thank Syngenta for their support today and providing us with the funding to be able to include Jesse and the group that we hear. So I'm going to start off by introducing Lynn Smith. Lynn is leads the legal and compliance function for Syngenta Canada's crop protection and seed business, with a focus on being consumer-centric and helping growers grow their best crop. Joining Syngenta as lead counsel and a member of the executive team in 2008, Lynn brought deep experience from her role as counsel for a major surgical equipment manufacturer with operations in Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Lynn holds a honors Bachelor of Science from McMaster University and a Bachelor of Laws from Western University. Lynn's ability to advocate and collaborate have led to a life of service. She was instrumental in the early expansion days of a well-known October fundraising run. She's built multiple homes with Habitat for Humanity, sat on the board of directors of nonprofits, providing early years STEAM-based programming. Her experience with people of different backgrounds, both from her professional life and her life of service, fueled her passion for inclusivity and diversity. Today, she combines that passion and her experience in advocacy at Syngenta, where she is responsible for the ED&I strategy for Syngenta Canada and the executive co-sponsor of its My Inclusion Employee Resource Group. Welcome, Lynn.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, I'll introduce EJ. EJ Fontaine is a Ojibwe from the Sangeen First Nation in Manitoba. He is father of 3 adult sons and has 2 grandchildren. He has over 30 years experience working with Indigenous organizations and people in various capacities. For the past 17 years, EJ has been an entrepreneur and co-founded AMIC Inc. AMIC has been successful in collaborating with corporations such as Great West Life, which is now Canada Life, CN, Air Canada, CPR, universities, in designing innovative recruitment and retention strategies for tapping into the Indigenous labor force. He also worked in delivering cultural awareness training, smart work ethics training, and other consulting type services. EJ is passionate in helping facilitate mutually respectful and productive relationships between Indigenous people and the corporate sector. In 2011, October, EJ and his partner wife received the Aboriginal Business Leader Award from the Asper School of Business at the University of Manitoba. In 2013, EJ received a Certificate of Merit from the University of Manitoba's Faculty of Agricultural and Food Scientists for his contribution to Manitoba's ag community. Thanks for joining us today, EJ.
Great.
Our next guest on the panel is Jordan Miller. Jordan grew up in an Air Force family and moved around a lot, but he always called Manitoulin Island home, having spent summers on the island with his extended family. Jordan studied athletic therapy at the University of Manitoba and worked as an athletic therapist and part-time instructor in the kinesiology program at Redeemer University College for 6 years. In 2015, Jordan and his wife, Kate, moved home to the farm where he and his extended family run a large cow-calf farm in western Manitoulin Island. Jordan farms full-time while his wife, Kate, works as a physician assistant at the Manitoulin Health Center, and together they are raising 2 energetic boys to respect our food production and our environment. Jordan joined the Beef Farmers of Ontario Board of Directors in February 2018. He has found the role fulfilling as he learns more about the industry, enjoys the opportunity to meet beef producers from all over Ontario, and works together to advance the Ontario beef industry. Thanks, Jordan, for joining us. And our 4th panelist is a former colleague of mine and a good friend, Dr. Bobby Thomas Cameron. He's currently the director of the Strategic Policy and Evaluation Division at the PEI Department of Agriculture and Land. He's chair of the Prince Edward Island Early Learning and Childcare Board. He's an adjunct professor with the Applied Communications Leadership and Cultural Program at the University of Prince Edward Island. Bobby holds a PhD in Policy Studies from Ryerson University, a Master of Arts in Public Policy and Administration from Ryerson, and a Bachelor of Arts in History and Political Studies from the University of Prince Edward Island. He's also a credential evaluator with the Canadian Evaluation Society. Bobby's research interests include public policy and public sector leadership, the theory and practice of contemporary policy work, and qualitative research methodologies. Bobby is currently an active member of several committees, including various FedProv territorial agricultural policy working groups. Bobby's PhD dissertation on policy capacity was nominated for a Governor General of Canada Academic Excellence Award, and he was a recipient of UPEI's Inspiring Alumni Award in 2019. He received the Premier of Prince Edward Island's Diversity and Inclusion Leadership Award in 2018. the Red Cross Young Humanitarian Award in 2010, and the Dan McIntyre Human Rights Award in 2010. And he also received the McGraw-Hill Rogerson's Publishers Integrity Initiative and Engagement Award in 2009. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you.
So after those wonderful introductions and a sense of the caliber of people we have in our panel, I'm actually going to start off with a question to Lynn, and I'll actually ask all of you to respond to this. Lynn, why do you personally believe, or why does your organization believe that the time is now in addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion? And why is this the right time for our agri-food system?
Yeah, it's a great question. So why is the time now? I think the time has always been in existence. If we've learned anything from Jesse, right, where even in 1957, Indigenous art was not recognized as art. Here at Syngenta, we've been working on it for some time, made advancements, but we still have to grow. And why is it important? I think using the example he used, right, the individual tree in the forest, gaining strength from the forest around it, but also the interconnectedness of the roots below. When I think about our current example, we're all facing COVID, right? I think about my own group, women in business. As a group, we have individuality within ourselves even. Some of us have young children, some of us are caring for elders, some of the people that we're caring for that aren't even blood relations. But in coming together and all of that individuality and the unique needs that we have, that's where we're finding strength. And how can we bolster each other through COVID and that environment? But first and foremost, we have to recognize this. So I think that there's a lot of connection to his analogy just in our own world. Stop and think about it, right? Why is that important to the agri-food sector? I think it's important to all sectors. As he indicated, our audiences and our consumers are a diverse group. But I think some of the work your group, John, has been doing around gaining public confidence and gaining public trust. I think that if we're going to gain confidence and trust in our industry, we have to engage. And in order to engage, again, you're coming right back to that, acknowledging the uniqueness of our audience. It's not a homogeneous audience, everybody eats, right? And we really need to embrace that. And by doing that, we start to understand and be able to have a better relationship. And with it comes more confidence in that relationship. We're in an era where science, for example, is under attack. All the more reason to have that engagement with our audience and really understand them. And I think that will bolster some of the confidence in our industry.
Thanks, Lynn. Wonderful. EJ, you are a member of the Sanghean First Nation in Manitoba, and you've worked with your people for over 30 years in this space. I'd like to get your sense of why it resonates with you or why it's so important.
To have diversity?
Yeah.
I believe it's for a number of reasons. One reason would be, based on our relationship with the land and the forests and the trees and everything. That a lot of our elders and our people have what we call a traditional knowledge of the areas, and so they bring a lot of untapped knowledge and experience in these types of issues, and a lot of times too often they're not tapped into for that knowledge, and we believe that everybody has gifts. Everybody has a gift that they can offer to a particular problem or an issue. So and a lot of times our knowledge is put on the back burner. And we were just talking about this the other day with my one of my cousins, professor at the University of Winnipeg, and they struggle with that all the time about trying to convince scientists to use the additional knowledge into research and different types of work that's done at that level. So I think our people have a lot to contribute to the issue. And also too, what makes it more urgent is because a lot of those people are now passing. A lot of the elders that do that knowledge are now leaving Mother Earth. So it's important to try and capture their knowledge before they're gone. Also, too, there's a whole resource out in the First Nations communities, Indigenous communities, in terms of a labor force. People we have the youngest and fastest growing population in North Canada, and there's a readily available workforce that could be tapped into, which is the work we do with corporations, is helping them tap into the workforce. And a lot of corporations in North Canada understand that, but they just don't know how to do it. So we're there to help them migrate to these communities. So that's what we do, and I think that would be the benefits to having our people involved in these types of things.
Excellent. Excellent. Thanks, EJ. Bobby, why do you personally believe, or what does the government of Prince Edward Island believe, that the time is now for addressing diversity, equity, inclusion? And why is this also an important time for our food system?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I would echo a lot of what EJ and Lynn were saying, as well as Jesse when he was giving his sort of great lecture earlier. I think from a very, well, one, I think it's the right thing to do, number one, but I think from a very practical standpoint and sort of more of a, I guess, a policy standpoint, when we're really looking at labor development, and EJ sort of mentioned this with Indigenous peoples and youth being, having a labor force that's young and readily available. We really have to be looking at agriculture and agri-food sort of with this broader look or broader perspective on labor development. So we need to be thinking broader about who can work in these industries and what conditions have to change to make our industries more inviting. So I think we can look at it from a very rational sort of, in some ways non-emotional perspective, saying, labor development's important, increasing the underrepresentation of groups that are historically underrepresented is important, but while recognizing that it can be a very emotional space, a very political space, and that there isn't a simple solution. I think specifically in agriculture, and I'm thinking farms here, and this is sort of the approach we've taken through official policy, through our own gender diversity and inclusion policy. When you think about things like succession planning, where farms are taken up by the next generation, some of the questions we've looked at and we've worked with here is how to better include underrepresented groups, be that women, be that youth, be that Indigenous people, to actually work within sort of that succession planning system. I think also very broadly too, there is changing expectations with respect to food and equity. So I think, it's not only just in terms of sustainability, but equity and food. So whether that's access to food, whether that's community food security, whether that's the conditions by which food is made and the treatment of workers within these systems, the public is expecting more, right? So there's both, I think, for government and industry in this space, the time is now, like, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, etc. The agri-food system is not immune from these and is very much implicated. And then finally, I think Lynn might have mentioned this, but I think Jesse did as well. The COVID-19 pandemic, really exacerbated or showed a lot of the unequal impacts to underrepresented groups. I know here in PEI, there were several reports in our local newspaper about women's experience in agriculture during the pandemic and the challenges of, balancing multiple sort of responsibilities. And this adds to other research that we did here in PEI previous to the pandemic, where it showed that, when we surveyed over 200 women in agriculture, they identified that there were indeed barriers, right? So I think, the COVID-19 pandemic for sure has had unequal impacts, but I think it's also exacerbated challenges. So all that to say is that really from a policy perspective and from the Department of Agriculture and Lands perspective, we are fully implicated in equity policy and gender diversity and inclusion policy. And there is a role for government in this space. And what we're doing right now through our policies, trying to figure out exactly what that is and where we can best support. So, yeah.
Thanks, Bobby.
Yeah.
Jordan, the organization you represent came out with a fairly strong statement supporting EDI and advancing that. And I'd like to get your input on why you think personally this is important, or why it's important for the organization that you represent. In fact, I think as we speak, you're having your annual meeting. So we'd like to get your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, thank you, John. Can you hear me okay, first of all?
Yeah.
I think the easy answer as to why it is now is we don't have a time machine to go back 50 years ago. So now is going to be the time. Now is going to be the time when change has to start to happen, because we can't go back and do it in the past. We know that less than 2% of the Canadian population produces the food in Canada. And we, in the agricultural sector, feel further and further separated and less understood by our urban neighbors and customers. At times, it's easy to feel sensitive and defensive, to feel like we're being judged for practices which we feel are good ethical ways to produce food. And so to build that connection and to reestablish that relationship, it's no longer a time where the average Canadian has a grandfather who is a farmer or a grandmother farmer. The separation is becoming further and further and further. So to build on Jesse's analogy, we're standing in a forest right now and all of our trees look the same. And I think we're realizing that that's not what a forest is supposed to look like. Beyond that, a different analogy I like to use is when we sit at the table of power in these organizations in Canada and we look around these tables, we see a lot of Caucasian men sitting at these tables of power. And we've opened the door and we've added chairs at the table to be welcoming to others. And that's good, and that can build robust, strong community. But what we're finding is a lot of that community that's being built is very homogenous. And so we have to come to the realization that we can add tables or chairs at our table, and that's fine. But if we really want true systemic change, we may have to change the way our table looks to begin with. Because our table, people coming to sit at our table in their own chairs may be awkward for them, may be uncomfortable. For some people, it may even be painful to sit at our table. So how can we change the table in general to build off of what Jesse was talking about, to strengthen all of us and to have, a truly diverse forest? Jesse, I don't think he's on the call anymore, but his community, his reserve is, as the crow flies, is very close to our farm here. It's a beautiful neck of the woods. And when he is referring to forest, it made me smile because there are some beautiful forests around the Serpent River First Nations Reserve. So we want to be able to have a table that's not just our table that other people can come to. We want to have a table that everybody wants to sit at and work at.
Create that culture of welcoming. Yeah. I'd like to go back to you, EJ. You talked about, the role that Indigenous folks can play in the food system. I'd be interested in hearing, because you have so much space and time in this, what have you seen were the biggest challenges to advancing inclusion in the food system, or even more broadly in society? And how can we work collaboratively to overcome these challenges?
Sure. The biggest one of the biggest barriers is a willingness to work together. And it's on both sides. To give you an example, when we were meeting with Cargill, one of the biggest grain companies in Canada, They had an elevator right next to one of the reserves, and the reserve was looking at that elevator and saying, "Wow, man, I wish we could work there." Then the Cargill was looking at the reserve and saying, "Wow, I wish we can get into that labor force there." And and they both had common interests, but nobody was talking to one another. So there has to be a willingness to come together and look at these opportunities that are sometimes just right under our feet. And so there's that, and then also there's a misunderstanding on both sides, or I would say a lack of knowledge about the cultures on both sides. When we go work with companies, we explain to them, well, you need to know our culture, but at the same time, our people need to know the culture of the corporation or of a farm. You know, and a farm is a business like any. When I go into our communities and I tell them I graduated from University of Agriculture, they ask me, well, what are you doing in business then? I said, well, farming is business. A little bit of a lack of knowledge on both sides that needs to be that gap has to close, and that's kind of work we do with these corporations is get them to understand our culture, and vice versa. We get our people to understand the corporate culture, and there's a meeting of cultures there that at the end produces a really good result. Our people get jobs, and the company adds diversity to their workforce, but also they attract customers that normally wouldn't go into their businesses. So, and there's a rising middle class in the Indigenous communities that are customers wanting to buy goods and services. So it makes sense for the business to want to diversify. So did I answer the question there?
No, you did. I really like what you said about, the willingness being the first step to making that connection. And I think that's important. Bobby, you've been around and you've received, awards from the Premier for your work in inclusion. What would you see, Bobby, as one of the biggest challenges to advancing inclusion in the food system or in society?
Well, I think at its core, sometimes what we see with resistance, which turns into be a challenge, is really about change management. So even, this is more of my personal belief, but I'm sure it's sort of documented in behavioral science research too. I don't really think most human beings are okay with change, right? At some level or some degree, change is uncomfortable, right? Whether it's positive or negative. And depending on your own background, depending on your exposure, depending on your position in the world, even just conversations about equity, diversity, and inclusion can trigger a feeling of change or change is coming. So I think change management, and thinking about, how to overcome that's in my own experience has been one of the biggest challenges, right? And identifying what that change may be when we're just having a conversation, or I think I'm just having a conversation. And then I think too, and it's funny how you learn things as you come on these panels, because originally, before I heard Jesse speak, I was going to say one of the biggest challenge is about changes in power dynamics, right? Because, I had kind of thought about, when we're creating level playing fields for groups that have been historically not given a seat at the table, as Jordan said, that there is a bit of a ceding of power, right? Or there's a bit of giving up of power. So I probably need some time to think about Jesse's conversation a little bit, because he is starting to change the way I'm thinking about that. But indeed, I think in my experience, one of the biggest challenges is exactly what Jesse said, is that people at least perceive themselves to be giving up power by promoting equitable principles or policies that would make changes for people that were underrepresented. And I think really the way to come over this is true dialogue, right? Like, when you look at glossy gender diversity and inclusion policies and very structured strategies, the human element is completely gone, right? My background's in policy, so I love those documents, but I realize that change doesn't come from a report, that's not where it happens. That provides the guide, it provides the commitment, it provides the accountability and the transparency. We need to have those conversations directly on the ground. And I think, industry can play a very large role here. I think government can provide structure, can provide funding, can provide a very loud voice in terms of leadership in the agri-food system. But at the end of the day, we're not the ones that are actually producing food, and we're not the actual ones that are sort of on the ground, for lack of a better word. So I think with all of that, it really comes down to dialogue and conversation and you know, structured but open approaches.
The human touch.
Yes, exactly.
Jordan, I'm going to jump to you now before I go to Lynn. And I'd be interested in your thoughts around how the industry can work more collaboratively to advance this.
I would too, John. I have about 5 pages of notes from Jesse's presentation, and it's, as Bobby said, it's going to take me some time to process all of it. From the Beef Farmers of Ontario perspective, we represent 19,000 members, and I don't have the census data in front of me, but I would venture to say that it's likely that of those 19,000 members that you're looking at a very homogenized group. I mean, from a business model perspective, cattle farming is remarkably capital intensive and liquid tight. It's a difficult business to crack into unless you've inherited or been given an opportunity. So a lot of our producers, like myself, you know, we would be the 6th generation on our land farming here, which ultimately makes it a very Eurocentric industry, right? So our AGM right now is one of our flagship offerings, which we put on throughout the year. Usually we're in Toronto at a fancy hotel, but now we're doing it virtually as everybody else is. But the room would look very, very homogenized at that AGM. So how do we, as a organization which represents, again, a very homogenized group, I'll use the term over and over and over again, how do we diversify? How do we create an industry which is welcoming to anyone who would be keen on being a part of it? And we need to sit down and have those serious discussions. I mean, I think when the Beef Farmers of Ontario, we originally set out to do an EDI statement, we reiterated over and over and over again, staff and board, the very first point on our EDI statement, our glossy EDI statement, as Bobby referenced to it. Our very first point would be that we need to be continually listening, and that this would be a living document, which is changing and changing and changing again, because we just don't have the answers. I think we'd be foolish to believe that the majority of our customers at this point in Ontario are Eurocentric. I mean, we know that the GTA now, as Jesse referenced, is predominantly visible minority, which I guess makes them a visible majority now. But how do we address those customers? How do we work with people in further processing facilities, employees with organizations like Cargill, who hire a lot of different ethnicities in their plants, and people from different walks of life and backgrounds. So how do we engage with people at all aspects of the value chain, including as well as their customer, when we as the Beef Farmers of Ontario don't look like that? So again, I've got notes here, and we're going to continue to have that discussion. And as I seem to find with a lot of these organizations that I'm a part of now, I'm doing more learning than contributing, but we need to continue the conversation moving forward. And I think the biggest thing is, the number one thing is that we just try to empathize with other people, understand that, again, going back to my table analogy, our table may need to change or does need to change. I think we could acknowledge that our table does need to change. And how can it be welcoming to everybody who wants to be a part of it?
And it may be the fact that the Beef Farmers of Ontario have signaled to the rest of other parts of the industry that this is important to us. So that signals to me that you're a leader, and being a leader means that you're willing to collaborate and work across different sectors.
And hopefully that others will be willing to show us grace when we trip and fall, which we inevitably will if we haven't already, without even acknowledging it. But
That's one of the things that when you look into this, that there's that fear of making a mistake that often will hold people back. Yeah. So I'd like to go to you, Lynn, and I'd like to get your thoughts on, what are some of the barriers or challenges to advancing inclusion, and how do we create a more collaborative nature among the sector to kind of work together to advance this?
I'm going to probably repeat some of the great points that have already been raised, but maybe just in a slightly different context. Both, I have a personal view, but I think it holds up in my corporate experience, which is we all have our own perceptions or biases about things. I mean, EJ, you gave the example, right? Cargill looking out at people going, there's a great workforce, but thinking for whatever reason, not really approaching. And then another group saying, hey, there's a great spot where we could, really tap into their labor needs. And yet we don't make that connection because we all have it. Like, I have my own biases. I've got young adult children, and I am constantly reminded of the biases I have that I don't even realize I have because of them. So we all have them. And I think that trying to constantly be aware of our own biases. Jordan, you gave a great example of, sometimes we trip up on those, but being aware that we have them, being able to say, you know what, I made a mistake and I'm trying to learn and I'm trying to be open to this. I think that goes a long, long way towards collaboration. And coming at it with an empathetic and open mind and an open heart, and sort of saying, hey, look, this is why I'm here, trying to make something that is better for everybody. I use the phrase in service of a lot in my own life. And I mean, I really think that if you are acting and coming to a problem in service of, not yourself, not, but the betterment of that issue, I think that goes a long, long way towards setting the right frame of mind in terms of what you're trying to accomplish. I think one of the other big things, and Jesse mentioned this, I think is metrics. I think a lot of individuals and a lot of corporations are afraid to measure metrics. I was really happy to hear him say, look, as a member of an Indigenous community, I know the numbers are bad because they are. And I think that as a corporations are often hesitant to measure because it's going to be a reflection, frankly, of where they're at. But by the same token, if you don't take a measurement and don't take stock of where you really are, how can you have a framework for where you want to get to and what you want to achieve? And so, to Jordan's point, maybe the table does have to change. The shape of the table has to change so people feel comfortable bringing their chair. If you don't even know that your table is rectangular or round in the first place, how do you know what shape you need to get it to? And so I think that metrics are really a hard thing for people to get their heads around. Because there's the fear too, like you said, of, oh, if I measure this, am I doing something wrong? Do I do it well? Do I do it respectfully? EJ, you mentioned the word respectful. It's a really key, important point in any of these discussions. But I do think those individual perceptions, those metrics, they are really, really important to being able to measure. And I think that when you get to collaboration, a metric is important as well, because when you can explain to somebody, pull out your map and say, I went on a major trip this summer and I camped my way across Canada, but I didn't do it saying, oh, here's my map of Canada, I'm not sure where I want to get to. I did it by saying, I want to get to here on day one and here on day two. And so when you can collaborate with somebody by saying, this is where we want to get to, because you've got metrics, you've got a measurement, I think that goes a long, long, long way towards developing the collaborative spirit.
Excellent. Very good. So I'm going to jump back to you, Bobby, put you on the hot seat for a sec. And this, it's kind of connected to the previous question about challenges, but this one is about if we experience resistance within our organizations to EDI, how do we deal with that resistance, or do you have any comments on how we overcome that?
Yeah. So I know this is definitely something I've experienced in, I guess, my own career and sort of working in this space. on and off. So as you would recall, John, back from when you were here as a deputy, we launched our first gender diversity and inclusion policy. So really that was very, very new for a Department of Agriculture. It was probably one of the first departments of agriculture in Canada, maybe still is, but I would love to know if there were other out there that have taken an explicit position on gender diversity and inclusion. So going back to that idea of, change management, it was important from the get-go to really just start with the most basic, or what I shouldn't even say the most basic, because that's based on my perception, but language, terminology, ideas, we did training on differences between gender and diversity and what it means to be, racialized. And so getting people familiar with these types of things, breaking down some of the barriers and ideas that by taking an explicit stance, much like Jordan's organization did, doesn't mean that you're giving up anything. It means we're recognizing something that we value. Little sort of tips that I found helped along the way was, that I learned as I went through, showing evidence of, from industry groups or articles that were based in agriculture and the agri-food system that said diversity and inclusion is important, helped to kind of increase that buy-in. So it wasn't just me as an individual or the policy division here promoting this new idea. It was coming from multiple areas. So that helped a lot. It also helped to have senior leadership very explicitly state that, this is important and here's the reason why. So yeah, I think that was a big piece of it, and tying it to in terms of resistance, tying it to a very rational business case helped with some people. So talking about succession planning and the importance of it, talking about having a sustainable workforce, so talking about having that just the strengths of having new ideas for people with different backgrounds and experiences. Having a seat at the agriculture table to make decisions will help in times of crisis. So all of those things, really, really do help. And if anyone has any questions, whether they're on the participant list or any of my fellow panelists, they want to kind of talk about this more later, I'd be happy to, because there's always, opportunity to learn about how to do these things better. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Jordan, I'm gonna jump to you now. And you talked about the large membership that the beef farmers of Ontario have, and I'd be interested to hear if your organization had any pushback from some of your members with your bold statement, and if that's the case, did you how did the organization deal with that?
Yeah, so at the board and staff level, absolutely not. When I sit at the board table and I look at the faces around the table, I see people who would buy into a statement like this wholeheartedly. At the membership level, yeah, there was a little bit of pushback. I won't lie, there was a little bit of pushback, but it was small, and it was from sort of rogue groups, and it wasn't a collective unified voice. The vast majority of the people were positive in their response. And then, I mean, the easiest answer is, how do you deal with people who disagree with you, is just to listen, try to empathize, and to have dialogue as opposed to preaching at. We're not putting forward a diversity, equity, and inclusion statement to sort of project a standard onto everybody else, which they have to adhere to immediately, or else, right? We're not gonna put forward ultimatums for our membership. Just to try to understand. Jesse referenced it a few times. Just try to understand why that pushback is happening, what the fear is rooted in, and to work through it from there. And hopefully we've been honoring and gracious to everybody as we've received that pushback. But at a personal level, the feedback's been very, very positive, which was the hope, I think, from the onset. And we've been approached by a few other commodity groups, just asking how the statement came to be and what the process was in creating the statement. And then yeah, and just working with them hand in hand. And then the next step, of course, and Lynn mentioned it and Jesse talked about it, is we're going to have to establish metrics, measurable metrics. The statement is out there now. I think making the statement was bold, but I don't think it's bold enough to just sit here now and pat ourselves on the back. So what are those metrics going to look like? And how can we include everybody into that conversation moving forward, even the people who did push back from the onset? I was one of the millions and millions of millennials who this summer bought and read the White Fragility book, which is on the New York Times best-selling list for so long. It was really impactful to me to realize it's okay to accept that we all have our biases and to acknowledge them, and then to work towards reparations from those biases, as opposed to running around screaming at the top of our lungs, I don't have biases, and just denying them to begin with. So I think that's where the conversation has to start.
Excellent. Now I'm going to go to you, Lynn, and you've worked in this space for some time. I wonder if you've experienced some pushback, and if you did, how did you manage that? How did you overcome it and deal with it?
We certainly have encountered pushback. I don't think that any organization is without its portions of its organization that are pushing back on it, or perhaps resistant. Any organization is reflective of the broader community, right? And so just the things we've been talking about today, things like bias, things like where they've come from, things like just the exposure, frankly, they might have had to some of these topics and the issues and the discussion and understanding. So one of the things, as I think everyone on this panel has said, comes back to when we encounter resistance, it's really about hard conversations, but done in a way that it is respectful, that it is embracing everybody's viewpoints for the purpose of understanding. Jordan made the comment, this is not about sort of preaching at somebody or, dictating to somebody. It's about bringing them into some awareness, education with an open mind, not preachy, trying to also understand and acknowledge where they're coming from, but then bridge that gap by hopefully helping them have a broader understanding of some of the issues that are faced by others, sort of just giving them a chance to walk in someone else's shoes for a moment, perhaps. To use an old saying. And then the other thing I think that we are really encouraging about within our organization is that just this concept of, Jordan, as you did, grabbing a book and reading, try to get as much of the education as you can, so that when you have a conversation with somebody else who might be of a differing opinion than you aren't asking them to simply educate you on the issue and change your mind. It's you're coming at it with some awareness and some information in your back pocket as well. So, coming back to this idea of maybe being a little bit collaborative in the way that you try to deal with the resistance that some people have to the issues, and doing it again in a way that is inviting, as opposed to sort of, pushing at. It's inviting them into the discussion.
Good. Great advice. EJ, I'm gonna finish up this question with your thoughts on, times that you may have encountered resistance, and I'm sure you have, and how, if you have any advice on how to deal with that. I think you're still on mute.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, so the first thing I want to acknowledge is what Lynn mentioned was collaboration. I think when we deal with companies and organizations that want to engage with Indigenous communities, we have to do that on a real collaborative method, because number one, and I think Jordan mentioned that as well, is the company is afraid to make mistakes along the way, and then they get sometimes those mistakes get blown out of proportion, So what we do is we have to work real collaboratively with industry and corporations so that, number one, they have confidence in wanting to engage the communities, but as well maybe help to avoid some of the mistakes that they might make if we weren't working collaboratively. As well, when we face resistance within companies for making changes within their workforce or their policies, etc., it's always nice to have the support and the backing of the top people in that company. So when we worked with companies like Canada Life or CN, we had really solid support from the executives, right from the board down. So if there was resistance that from some of the staff or the managers, we were able to go to back to the corporation, the executives, and let them know that while we're feeling some maybe some resistance, some unmovement, we need some help. And so we were very happy that a lot of those executives would come in and make the staff and the managers understand that no, we're going to do this. This we need to do this. So we have to. It's going to get done. So when we have that kind of support from the top, it really helps to make the project implementation much smoother. And then we also had resistance when we had a the cultural awareness session with the Keystone agricultural producers here. But we were supposed to have a session with the board, and only one board member showed up, and the rest of the people in the session were staff. And so the problem there was that I think there's some conflict in terms of perceptions about the land, and those types of conflicts are not going to be resolved overnight. And so the farmers didn't want to come to the table because they have disagreements with some of the politicians over land. So nobody wants to come together and talk. So there has to be collaboration and a willingness to listen to both sides of the table, so that there's some commonalities. And when we did a presentation at the University of Manitoba Agriculture, one of our leaders said, well, the first thing that we need to understand is we both have a common understanding that the land needs to be cared for. That's that, and if we can establish discussions and collaboration based on that, I think we can maybe have some really good movements towards seeing some of these opportunities come to fruition for both sides. So, Miigwech.
Excellent. So we only have a few minutes left, 4 actually, and I'm going to ask each of you very briefly to offer advice on one thing, and I might as well start with you, EJ, that you're here. What is one thing you would suggest, in a minute or less, of a call to action for the people that are listening in to our webinar today?
A call to action, I would say, would be not to hesitate and don't have fear in engaging one another. For instance, for industry not to be afraid to engage our people, because our people are ready and willing to talk and have discussions so that everybody has mutual benefits. That's in the end, that's what it's all about, is having mutual benefits, building mutual respect and mutual trust. I think if we can build those as the foundation, I think we would have a really great relationship and see opportunities come for everybody.
Mutual respect is the basis for an awful lot. I'm going to jump to you now, Bobby, and you get your thoughts briefly on one thing that you would like us to take away with, or the people that are here as a call to action.
I think as a call to action, we could probably, I think for those who come from organizations similar to Jordan's, just recognizing how incredibly important it is to have that initial statement, right? So develop those internally, right? Like make sure your organization at a minimum is settling on what it values with gender diversity and inclusion and equity. And then I think for government folk that are on the, the call, or people that work for governments, I think, once we have an idea of what the industries that we represent, what their goals and values are with respect to equity, gender diversity, and inclusion, then we can jump in, right, with looking at funding, structure, policy, right? So I think that's what we can take away.
Excellent. Thank you, Bobby. Jordan, what are your thoughts on something to leave us with?
Well, coming from a humble beef farmer, my resume compared to EJ, Bobby, and Lynn's is a little bit different. I was out this morning, my overalls throwing around hay bales. So I think it's important when you look at organizations of the past, that those who fight to preserve what they are and maintain status quo, they fail. You're either advancing or you're moving backwards. And it's as simple as that. What really struck me with what Jesse said, and this is my paraphrasing, this isn't a direct quote, but when he said, when systems are not diverse, we must accept we've been investing in them being non-diverse since the system was started. Yeah, that's kind of a mic drop right there. That's what we have to do. We have to start here, and we have to look to change, or we will fail.
Wonderful. And the last word of the day goes to you, Lynn.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you to all the panelists very much. I think my message would be, I think everyone who's still here on this discussion has an open heart, an open mind to this topic. I think my call to action to everybody would be to continue that journey. You're all on your own individual journey around inclusion, but be courageous with an open heart. You think of the word courage, right? It comes from the French cœur, the heart. Bring that to the table with your friends, your family, your colleagues, and help them along their journey. Be willing to have an open conversation. Listen to where they're at. That will start to promote their journey as well. And just keep doing things empathetically, respectfully, and in a listening and understanding way. And I think that's really what I would say is the way forward.
Thank you. Wonderful. I want to thank all four of you for taking the time and being so gracious with your advice and thoughts and time. It's been wonderful. And I think this is a great opportunity for us all to learn and maybe do better, because it's really all about progressing. As we wrap up, again, I want to thank Syngenta for their great support for this webinar and helping us be the presenting sponsor. Again, this is the first of 3 events that we will have lead up events to our fall summit, and we know many of the people on the call here today will be participating in that in the fall. So again, great, thank you very much. The recording of this webinar will be going up on our website fairly shortly. And, feel free to share it with your friends and advance it as we move forward. So again, thanks everyone. Thanks to everyone that signed in. We really appreciate it. And have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.